She fell frozen in the snow, the cowboy who saved the Apache woman no one else saw. The snow had been falling since morning, slow at first, then heavier, until the whole land looked like it had disappeared. The sky and the ground became the same white color, and even the wind seemed confused about which way to blow. Nothing moved on the open plains except one man and his horse. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter around his body as the cold bit through the thick wool. His horse stepped carefully, each hoof sinking into the deep snow with a soft, tired sound. They had been on the trail longer than planned, and now the storm was closing in fast. The world felt empty, as if everyone else had vanished, and only he remained. He told himself he should keep riding, should reach his cabin before dark. In weather like this, stopping was dangerous. The cold did not forgive mistakes. Many men had been lost to storms like this, not because they were weak, but because they paused for too long. The wind howled, pushing snow into his eyes. He lowered his head and urged the horse forward. That was when he saw something strange. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow, just a darker patch on the white ground. It was easy to miss, easy to ignore. Most people would have ridden past without a second thought. The plains were full of tricks like that. Snow played games with the eyes, and shadows often meant nothing. But something inside him told him to stop. He slowed the horse and turned slightly, squinting through the storm. The shape did not move. It was too long to be a rock, too soft to be a tree branch. The closer he looked, the more uneasy he felt. He slid off his horse, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The wind tried to push him back, but he stepped forward anyway. Each step was harder than the last. The cold burned his face and hands, and his breath came out in thick, white clouds. When he reached the shape, his heart dropped. It was a woman. She lay on her side, half covered by snow, her dark hair frozen stiff against her face. Her clothes were thin and torn, no match for the weather. Her skin was pale from the cold, and her lips were a faint shade of blue. If he had arrived even a little later, she would have blended completely into the snow, never to be seen again. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking, not just from the cold, but from fear. He gently touched her arm. It was stiff and icy, like touching a piece of frozen wood. For a terrible moment, he thought he was too late. Then he saw it. Her chest moved, just barely. A small, weak breath escaped her lips. "She's alive," he whispered, though no one was there to hear him. The storm roared around them, but in that moment the world felt silent. He looked around, as if expecting someone else to appear, to tell him what to do. But there was no one, just him, the horse, and a woman who had been left behind by the storm. He knew who she was the moment he saw her face. Her features told a story older than the land itself. She was Apache. A heavy feeling settled in his chest. Helping her would not be simple. People in the towns nearby did not look kindly on Apache women. Old anger lived in their words, in their stories, in the way they raised their children. If they found out he had brought her into his home, they would ask questions he did not want to answer. But as the wind cut deeper and the snow piled higher, none of that seemed to matter. She was dying. And he was the only one there. He carefully lifted her head, supporting her neck, and tried to wake her. "Hey," he said softly, as if speaking louder might break her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open for a second, dark and unfocused, then closed again. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was enough. It meant she was still fighting. The cowboy did not hesitate anymore. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, even though the cold hit him instantly. He slid his arms beneath her and lifted her from the snow. She was lighter than he expected, like the wind itself could carry her away. That scared him more than anything. He placed her carefully across the saddle, securing her so she would not fall. Then he climbed back onto his horse, turning it toward home. The ride back felt longer than it ever had before. The storm grew worse, the wind screaming in his ears, the snow blinding him again and again. He leaned forward, shielding the woman with his body as much as he could. His hands went numb, and his face burned, but he did not stop. Every step the horse took felt like a small victory. At last a dark shape appeared through the white cabin. It stood alone near a small line of trees, smoke rising weakly from the chimney. He had left a fire burning that morning, hoping it would still be alive when he returned. Now he prayed it was. He jumped down, rushed to the door, and pushed it open with his shoulder. Warm air hit his face like a gift. The fire still burned, low but alive. He carried the woman inside and laid her gently on his bed, the only soft place in the room. He moved fast but carefully, the way you do when someone's life depends on your hands. He removed her frozen outer clothes, replacing them with dry blankets. He stoked the fire until the room glowed orange. The cabin filled with warmth and the smell of burning wood. Still, she did not wake. He sat beside her, watching her chest rise and fall, slow and uneven. Every breath felt like it might be her last. He had never been so afraid in his life. Not of storms, not of wild land, not of men with guns. This fear was different. It was quiet, heavy, and full of waiting. Hours passed. The storm continued outside, banging against the walls, trying to get in. Inside, the cowboy fed the fire, wiped snow from his boots, and kept his eyes on her face. Her skin slowly lost its icy color, and a faint warmth returned. He thought about how close she had been to disappearing forever. If he had been a minute later, if he had looked away, if he had ignored the shadow. No one would have known she was there. He sat back in his chair, exhausted, his hands wrapped around a cup of warm water he had managed to heat. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire and her soft breathing. For the first time since finding her, he allowed himself to hope. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that small cabin, something had changed. A life had been saved. The fire burned all through the night, and the cowboy never let it die. Each time the flames grew weak, he added more wood, even when his eyes were heavy and his body ached. The storm outside did not slow down. The wind shook the walls of the cabin, and snow pressed against the windows like a living thing trying to get inside. The woman lay still on the bed, wrapped in blankets, her breathing shallow but steady. Sometimes she made small sounds, soft and broken, like she was dreaming of something far away. Each time she moved, the cowboy lifted his head, afraid she might slip back into the cold world he had pulled her from. He had seen many winters, but he had never faced one like this. Not because of the storm, but because of the choice he had made. Helping her meant danger. He knew that clearly now, as the quiet hours of the night gave his thoughts too much space to grow. If anyone found out, they would ask why he brought her here. Some would say he was foolish. Others would say worse. In this land, people remembered old pain, and they did not let it go easily. But the more he watched her breathe, the less he cared about what they might say. When morning came, the storm was still there. The world outside was nothing but white and noise. He opened the door just long enough to look out, then closed it again quickly. The cold rushed in like a wild animal, and he felt it bite his hands. There was no way to take her anywhere yet. Even if he wanted to, the trails were gone. They were trapped together in that small cabin, two strangers held by snow and silence. He warmed water over the fire and dipped a cloth into it, then carefully wiped her face. Her skin was no longer frozen, but it was still cold, still weak. As he cleaned her, he noticed scars on her hands, thin lines that spoke of hard work and harder life. These were not the hands of someone who had been cared for. These were the hands of someone who had survived. He wondered how long she had been alone before the storm found her. All day, he stayed close. He fed the fire, cooked a little food for himself, and kept watch. Every now and then she moved, her fingers curling slightly, her head turning as if she were trying to wake from a long sleep. But her eyes stayed closed. The hours passed slowly, stretching like the snow outside. As evening came again, worry began to grow inside him. What if she did not wake? What if the cold had taken too much from her? He was not a doctor. He only knew what the land had taught him: warmth, rest, patience. That was all he could give. He sat beside her and spoke quietly, though he knew she might not hear him. He told her about the storm, about his horse, about the small cabin that kept them safe. His voice filled the room, and somehow that made the silence easier to bear. That night her breathing changed. It grew faster, uneven. She stirred, her face twisting like she was in pain. He reached out, placing his hand near hers, not touching, just close enough so she would know she was not alone. She whispered something in a language he did not understand. The words were soft but urgent, filled with fear. He leaned closer, trying to catch the sound, but it slipped away like smoke. "It's all right," he said gently. "You're safe. The storm can't get you here." Her eyes opened then. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Her eyes were dark and deep, full of confusion and fear. She tried to move, but her body was weak, and she fell back against the pillow with a small gasp. Her eyes widened and she pulled the blanket closer around herself, her hands shaking. He raised his hand slowly, showing her he meant no harm. "Easy," he said. "You were freezing. I brought you here." She did not understand his words, but she understood his tone. Still, fear lived in her eyes. She looked around the cabin, at the fire, the walls, the man sitting near her bed. Her breathing was fast, her body tense, ready to fight or run if she could. He stayed where he was, not moving closer, giving her space. The fire crackled between them, warm and steady. Outside, the storm still screamed, but inside, everything felt fragile, like one wrong move could break it. She spoke again, more clearly this time. The words were sharp, quick, filled with emotion. He shook his head slowly. "I don't understand," he said softly. "But you're safe, I promise." The word promise meant nothing to her, but the calm in his voice reached her. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, studying his face like she was trying to read something there. He noticed then how tired she looked, not just from the cold, but from life. There was a deep weariness in her eyes, the kind that comes from running too long and losing too much. She lifted her hand slightly, pointing to herself, and said a word. He did not know the meaning, but he knew it was her name. He nodded. Then he pointed to himself and said his own name. For a moment, something small but important passed between them. A bridge, thin but real. The next days followed the same pattern. The storm slowly weakened, but the snow remained deep. The cabin became their world. He cooked simple food, helping her eat when she was too weak to hold the bowl. She drank water carefully, her hands still shaking. Each day she grew a little stronger. They did not share many words, but they shared time. Silence filled the space between them, but it was no longer heavy. It was calm. Still, danger waited outside those walls. On the third day he heard voices. They were faint at first, carried by the wind, but he knew the sound of men calling to one another. His body went still. He moved to the window and looked out carefully. Through the trees he saw shapes, men on horses, searching. His heart began to pound. They were looking for her. He stepped back from the window and looked at the woman. She was sitting up now, watching him closely. She saw the fear on his face, and her own fear returned at once. He placed a finger to his lips, asking for silence. She nodded, her eyes wide. The voices grew closer. The cowboy knew then that the storm was not the only danger they faced. The voices outside faded as the men moved away, their words swallowed by the wind and trees. The cowboy did not breathe easily until the sound was completely gone. He stood still for a long time listening, making sure the danger had passed. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin. The woman was sitting on the bed, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on the door, and her body was tense, like a wild animal, ready to run. She looked at him, waiting for something, maybe answers, maybe fear, maybe the truth. He walked slowly toward the fire and added a piece of wood. The flames grew brighter, filling the room with warm light. Then he turned to face her and spoke softly.
"They're gone," he said, even though he knew she might not understand the words.
"You're safe for now." She watched his face carefully, studying every move. Slowly, her shoulders dropped, and she let out a breath she had been holding for too long. She touched her chest lightly and closed her eyes for a moment, as if thinking something unseen. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not calm anymore. It was full of questions. She pointed toward the door, then toward herself, and shook her head. Her meaning was clear. She could not stay here. The danger would return. He nodded slowly. "I know," he said, "but you're not strong enough yet." The snow is still deep. She frowned, not understanding the words, but understanding the feeling. She looked down at her hands, then at her legs, as if realizing her weakness again. Frustration crossed her face, and for a moment she looked like she might cry, but she didn't. She straightened her back and lifted her chin. Strength lived in her even now. That was when he realized something important. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of the world outside. The next day the storm finally ended. The wind died and the sky cleared, leaving a pale blue horizon behind the white land. Sunlight touched the snow, making it shine like glass. It was beautiful and dangerous at the same time. He stepped outside and checked the trails. The snow was still deep, but the worst was over. He could travel again soon, but not yet. Not with her still so weak. When he returned, she was standing near the table, holding onto it for balance. She looked proud, like the act of standing was a victory. He smiled without thinking, and when she saw his face, she smiled too. Small and careful, but real. That smile changed something between them. From that moment, she tried harder. Each step was slow, each movement painful, but she refused to stay in bed. He helped her when she allowed it, and when she didn't, he stood nearby, ready to catch her if she fell. They began to understand each other without words. He showed her how to hold a cup, how to sit near the fire, how to wrap herself tighter in the blankets. She showed him which herbs she had found in the snow before collapsing, pointing and speaking softly, her hands moving like she was telling a story. He didn't know the words, but he knew they mattered. At night she sometimes woke suddenly, her breath fast, her eyes full of fear. He would sit nearby, speaking gently until the fear passed. She never asked him to touch her, and he never did. Respect was the only language they shared clearly. One evening, she finally spoke more than a few words. She pointed toward the horizon and said something long and slow, her voice full of pain. Then she drew a line across her throat, not as a threat, but as a memory. Her hand shook as she finished, and tears filled her eyes. He understood enough. She had been running. She had lost people. She had nowhere left to go. He sat quietly, letting her speak, even though he could not understand the language. Pain sounded the same in every tongue. When she finished, she looked at him, waiting to see if he would turn away, if he would judge her like others had. But he didn't. He only nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. No one should have to run like that. She did not understand the words, but she understood his face. The tightness in her chest loosened, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the tears. From that night on, trust grew between them, slow and careful like a seed under snow. They shared meals, simple and quiet. He fixed a tear in her clothing while she watched, curious. She laughed once, a soft sound that surprised them both, when the thread tangled in his fingers. The cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. But peace never lasted long in that land. 2 days later he found tracks near the trees, fresh tracks. His stomach turned cold. The men were back, or others like them. The search had not ended. He knew then that staying longer would only bring danger to her and to him. That night he sat by the fire, thinking. The flames danced and shadows moved along the walls. She sat across from him, watching his face like she knew something was wrong. He pointed toward the door, then toward the distance, then placed his hand over his heart. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. She understood. Her eyes widened, then softened. She nodded once, strong and steady. The decision was made. They would leave before sunrise. As he lay down to sleep, he knew everything was changing again. The storm had passed, but a new journey waited. One that would test them both more than the snow ever had. Outside, the land was quiet and wide, holding their future in its silence. They left before the sun rose. The world was still dark, and the snow was hard under their feet, frozen from the night cold. The cowboy moved quietly, leading the horse by the reins. The woman walked beside him, wrapped in blankets and wearing his extra coat. She was still weak, but her steps were steady. Each breath came out as white smoke, disappearing into the air. They did not speak. The silence was safer. The trees stood tall and still, like silent guards watching them pass. Every sound felt loud, the soft crunch of snow, the horse's slow breathing, the quiet wind moving through branches. The cowboy's eyes stayed alert, searching the land for movement, for shadows that did not belong. They followed a narrow path he knew well, one that cut through the hills and away from the main trail. It was longer, harder, but safer. Fewer people used it. Fewer people even knew it existed. As the sky slowly turned from black to gray, the woman stumbled once. He caught her arm before she fell. For a moment she held on to him, her fingers gripping his sleeve tightly. Then she let go, embarrassed. He only nodded, letting her know it was all right. They walked for hours. The sun finally rose, painting the snow in soft gold. The land looked peaceful, but the cowboy knew better. Peace was only a mask the land wore sometimes. They reached a ridge and stopped to rest. From there, the land stretched far and wide, empty and quiet. The woman stood beside him, her eyes searching the horizon. He could tell she was trying to find something familiar. Mountains, trees, a sign of home. Instead, she found nothing. Her shoulders dropped, and for a moment she looked very small in the open space. He wanted to say something to make it better, but there were no words for that kind of loss. So he stayed close, letting her know she was not alone in the silence. They moved again, slower now. The path led down into a narrow valley where the snow was deeper and the shadows longer. The horse struggled, and the woman's breathing grew heavier. The cowboy began to worry. Then he heard it, a voice, faint but close. He froze, raising his hand. The woman stopped instantly, her body tense. He listened carefully. Another voice joined the first, then the sound of hooves. They were not alone. He pulled the woman behind a cluster of rocks and led the horse into the shadows. They crouched low, barely breathing. The voices grew louder, clearer. Men were coming down the main trail above them, talking and laughing, unaware of how close they were. The cowboy held his breath, his heart pounding so hard he was sure they would hear it. He felt the woman's hand touch his arm, light but trembling. He did not look at her, but he placed his hand over hers, steady and calm. The men passed by. Their shadows stretched across the snow, then disappeared. The sound of hooves faded, and the valley returned to silence. Only then did the cowboy breathe again. They stayed hidden for a long time, just to be sure. When he finally moved, his legs felt weak. The woman looked at him with wide eyes, her face pale. He nodded once, telling her it was over. For now. They continued the journey, but fear followed them like a shadow. Every sound made them stop. Every movement in the distance made them turn. By late afternoon, the woman was struggling again. Her steps were slow, and her face was pale. The cowboy knew they could not keep going much longer. He searched the land until he found a small hollow near the trees, hidden from the open trail. They rested there. He built a small fire, careful to keep the smoke low. She sat close to the warmth, her hands shaking. He gave her water and a little food, helping her drink slowly. Her eyes closed as the warmth reached her bones, and for a moment she looked peaceful. But peace never lasted long. As the sky darkened, the wind returned, cold and sharp. The fire struggled, and the shadows grew long. The woman suddenly sat up, her eyes wide, her head turning sharply toward the trees. She heard something before he did. A branch snapped. He stood up slowly, his hand tightening on the reins. His eyes searched the dark, his body ready to move. The horse shifted nervously, sensing danger. Then he saw it, a shape moving between the trees. His heart dropped. They had been followed. He grabbed the woman's hand and pulled her to her feet. There was no time to hide, no time to think. Only one path remained, forward. They ran. The snow slowed them, and the woman stumbled, but she did not fall. The cowboy stayed beside her, holding her arm, guiding her through the dark. The wind howled, and the trees closed in around them, but they did not stop. Behind them, voices shouted. He could not hear the words, but he did not need to. Fear sounded the same in every language. They reached a narrow pass between two hills, a place he remembered from long ago. It was steep and dangerous, but it led away from the main trails. He pulled the woman through, pushing forward even as his lungs burned and his legs screamed. The voices grew fainter. Then they were gone. The night swallowed the sound, leaving only their heavy breathing and the wild beat of their hearts. They collapsed into the snow, exhausted, alive. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, the woman lifted her head and looked at him. Her eyes were full of something new, not fear, not pain, but deep understanding. She placed her hand over his chest, feeling his heart still racing. Then she nodded slowly. It was a silent thank you. He helped her stand, and together they moved deeper into the hills, where the land was rough and the trails were lost. The world behind them faded, and the world ahead waited, unknown and wide. The cowboy knew one thing for certain now. The hills grew steeper as they moved forward, and the snow slowly began to thin. The land changed shape, becoming rough and uneven, full of rocks and narrow paths that only animals and people who knew the land would dare to follow. The cowboy felt relief in that. Fewer trails meant fewer people. Fewer people meant safety. The woman walked beside him, quiet but strong. Her steps were slow, but they were steady. Every now and then she would stop, close her eyes, and take a deep breath, like she was listening to the land itself. When she opened her eyes, she always seemed more sure of the direction. He began to realize that she was no longer following him. They were walking together. By midday the air felt different. It was not as sharp, not as cruel. The wind softened, and the sun warmed their faces. The cowboy looked around and saw signs of life returning. Small plants pushing through the snow, birds moving in the distance. It felt like they were leaving winter behind, step by step. They reached a high point where the land opened into a wide valley. Below them, trees stood tall and thick, and beyond them, the land rolled gently toward distant mountains. The woman stopped walking. She stared at the valley, her eyes filling with tears. But this time, the tears were not from fear. They were from hope. She pointed toward the trees and spoke a few words, her voice shaking. He did not understand the language, but he understood the feeling. This place meant something to her. It was close to home. Maybe it was home. He nodded slowly, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness in his chest. Their journey together was ending. He had known it would, but now that the moment was close, it felt heavier than he expected. They walked down into the valley together. The land felt different here, older, quieter, alive in a way he could not explain. The woman's steps grew stronger, her back straighter. She moved like she belonged, like the land recognized her. Near the trees, she stopped again. She turned to him, holding her hands together tightly, as if she was trying to hold on to the moment. She spoke softly, her voice full of emotion, then placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly. He felt his throat tighten. "You're safe now," he said gently, even though she might not understand the words. "That's what matters." She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was warm, steady. She held it for a long moment, then let go slowly, like she was letting go of a piece of the past. Then she stepped back. She turned and walked toward the trees without looking behind her. Her shape moved between the trunks, growing smaller, until finally she disappeared into the land. The cowboy stood there, alone again. The silence was deep, but it was not empty. It was full of everything they had survived together: snow, fear, fire, trust, and the quiet strength that had carried them forward. He turned his horse toward home. The ride back felt longer than the journey there, but it was different. The land looked the same, but he was not. Every step of the horse felt like a memory, each mile a reminder of what one small choice could change. When he reached his cabin, the door stood exactly as he had left it. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The fire was gone. The place felt colder than before, even though the storm had passed. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The cabin was quiet. He sat in his chair by the fire pit, staring at the empty bed. He could almost hear her soft breathing, see her sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance. The room held her presence like a shadow that would not fade. He lit the fire again, slowly, carefully. As the flames grew, warmth returned to the cabin, but something else stayed cold inside him, a feeling he could not name. Not sadness, not regret, but a deep understanding of how close two lives can come and how quickly they can part. Days passed. The snow melted. The land softened. Life moved on, as it always did. But the cowboy did not forget. Sometimes when the wind moved through the trees just right, he thought he heard her voice in the distance. Sometimes when he looked across the plains, he imagined her walking strong and free, the land rising to meet her steps. He never told anyone what happened. Not because he was afraid, but because the story belonged to the land now. It was part of the wind, the snow, the quiet hills where few people ever walked. Years later, when his hair had turned gray and his hands were slower, he would still remember that storm. He would remember the shadow and the snow that he almost ignored. And he would remember the woman who taught him that saving one life could change your own forever. On quiet nights, when the fire burned low and the stars filled the sky, he would sit outside his cabin and look toward the distant hills. He never expected to see her again, but he hoped she was still walking, still strong, still free, and in that hope he found peace. The land had taken many things from him over the years, but that winter it had given him something in return.